The night had fallen heavy over the valley, the kind of night where the stars looked close enough to touch, and the crickets sang louder than the church bell ever did. In that little American village, tucked between dust roads and tall pines, stories were whispered more than they were written, and some stories lived long enough to haunt the air for years. One such story began with a stranger and Apache man who wandered into the edge of town, silent as the shadow of the hills. Folks watched him with wary eyes, for in those years, the late 1800s, the line between fear and curiosity was thinner than paper. He came with no horse, no weapon on his back, only the look of a man who had carried more burdens than words. The villagers told themselves they wanted no trouble, but it was hard not to notice him. The old women sewing on their porches whispered of his height, his stillness, the fire in his dark eyes. The younger men muttered with clenched jaws, uneasy with the way their wives looked a little too long when he passed. The children scattered when his boots touched the dust, yet some of them peeked back, sensing a story was moving through their lives, one that would not be easily forgotten. Among them all was a girl, known not by a name that was often spoken, but by the mark she carried, her innocence, her purity, the way the preacher's wife called her the Virgin, as if it were both a title and a warning. She was not like the other village women who walked with shoulders bent under duty. She carried herself with a quiet flame, a gentleness that made folks protective, though some said she had a streak of longing in her, that the town's narrow fences could not keep caged out. It was on a night when the air smelled of rain and wood smoke that she crossed paths with the Apache. No one could say what words passed between them, or if words were even needed. All that is remembered is that the two walked together where no one could see, beyond the edge of the fields where the lantern light of the village faded. The moon, heavy and pale, became their only witness. It was a night that left no record, no testimony, only the lingering sense that something sacred, or perhaps forbidden, had come to pass. By morning, the stranger was gone, leaving only footprints pressed into the earth like a secret carved into the land itself. The village went on with its days. Wagons rattled down the dirt road, blacksmiths pounded their iron, and children chased each other past the chapel steps. But behind closed doors, whispers grew. Some claimed they had seen the Virgin walking home at dawn with her hair unpinned, her eyes bright as though lit from within. Others swore the Apache had been no ordinary man at all, but a spirit come down from the hills, here to test the boundaries of faith and flesh. No one asked her outright, for her silence was answer enough. The story became one of those village half-truths, spoken softly, never settled. 3 years rolled by like wagon wheels over ruts. The seasons turned, the village aged, and still the memory of that stranger lived only in rumors. The girl, though, was no longer just the Virgin. She was a mother now. A small child clung to her skirts, a boy with hair dark as midnight and eyes that carried the storm of two worlds. He laughed easily, ran faster than the other children, and sometimes, when he stood still in the fields, he looked too much like the man who had once walked into the valley and vanished with the dawn. The villagers pretended not to see the resemblance. They greeted her politely in the marketplace, offered her bread or cloth, but behind their eyes burned questions they dared not voice. The preacher's wife smiled too wide, the blacksmith's daughter looked away, and the men spat in the dust. When the boy passed, as if trying to rid their mouths of a taste they could not swallow. Yet no one spoke, for silence was safer than truth, and truth in that town was heavier than stone. Then, one late afternoon, as the shadows stretched long and the air was thick with the smell of wheat and horses, the Apache returned. He came the way he had left, wordless, stepping out of the tree line as if he had always been watching, waiting. Time had changed nothing in him. His shoulders carried the same strength, his eyes the same fire, though now they seemed sharpened, aware of what he had left behind. The village froze. Men tightened their grips on tools, women drew children close, and the bell at the chapel went silent as though even metal dared not call out. The Virgin, now a mother, turned and saw him standing there, her breath caught. The boy at her side tugged at her dress, not knowing why the world had gone still, only sensing that something vast and unspoken had arrived. The Apache's eyes moved from her to the child. In that moment, time itself seemed to falter. The villagers held their breath, for they knew what they saw, even if none would name it. The likeness, the truth, the past returned. He did not speak, but the weight in his gaze said more than words could ever carry. The boy looked back at him, wide-eyed, innocent, unaware of the storm he was born into. And just as the air grew heavy, just as the first murmur rose among the watching crowd, a sound cracked across the stillness, the strike of a rifle being cocked somewhere nearby. The Apache did not move. The Virgin did not breathe. The child clung tighter to her hand. And the village, in that suspended moment, waited to see if the past had come to claim its place, or if the story would end before it could truly begin. The sharp click of the rifle seemed to echo through the valley, louder than thunder. No one knew who had raised the weapon, for the crowd stood scattered, half hidden in shadows, their faces stiff with fear and judgment. The Apache did not flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the child, the boy who stared back at him with wide, unblinking eyes, a mirror of a life neither had yet claimed. The Virgin held her son tighter, her knuckles pale against the fabric of her dress, though her eyes never left the man she had once known. The air was thick with waiting, and in that silence, the whole village seemed to tremble under the weight of an unspoken truth. The preacher's voice broke the stillness, soft but steady, reminding them all that God watched every step, every secret. But his words hung hollow, for no sermon could untangle what had been set in motion that night 3 years before. The Apache lowered his head slightly, neither yielding nor challenging, but as if listening to something deeper than the voice of the crowd. The boy shifted at his mother's side, restless yet curious, too young to know the danger, old enough to sense its pull. And then, without warning, the sound of the rifle was gone, no shot fired. Whoever had threatened faded back into the crowd, leaving only the press of unease behind. Life in the village, though, could not simply return to what it had been. The Apache stayed. He made no claim, no announcement, only a presence that could not be ignored. Some nights he lingered at the edge of the fields, watching the horizon. Other nights he walked the dirt road in silence, his shadow stretching long. In the lamplight, the townsfolk muttered among themselves, voices rising in barns and back rooms, yet none dared confront him outright. Fear and curiosity tangled like vines in their hearts. Some swore he had come to take the child, others whispered he carried revenge in his chest, while a few believed he was nothing more than a man searching for a piece of his own lost life. Virgin though many had stopped calling her, that aloud lived each day with quiet strength. She tended to her son, who grew wilder with every season, running barefoot through the fields, climbing fences, chasing after the wind as if it were kin to him. The boy's laughter filled spaces where silence had once reigned, but when he was still, when he looked into the distance with that steady fire in his eyes, the villagers saw the Apache reflected in him, and it unsettled them. They could not decide if the child was a blessing or a warning. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Dust still rose from the wagon wheels, smoke still curled from chimneys, but beneath the surface, the tension coiled tighter. Farmers sharpened their tools with restless hands. The blacksmith hammered harder on his iron, and the preacher's sermons grew sterner, warning of temptation, of sin, of the dangers of blood that did not belong. Mothers pulled their children close when the boy ran past, Though their eyes followed him with a mix of pity and fear, it was the old midwife who spoke most plainly, though only in whispers to those who would listen. She remembered the night the Virgin had disappeared into the fields. The way she had returned at dawn, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. She had seen women like that before, carrying the mark of a moment that could never be erased. The midwife knew the child's blood carried two worlds, and she warned that such things rarely passed quietly in a place that thrived on order and sameness. Apache himself remained a mystery. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a weight that stilled even the loudest tongues. Some claimed he prayed to the earth, kneeling alone at the edge of the woods. Others swore they had seen him carve shapes into the bark of trees, symbols that no one could read. The younger boys of the village sometimes dared each other to follow him, but they always returned before nightfall, uneasy with the stillness that seemed to follow in his steps. He was no ordinary stranger. That much was certain. He was something between a man and a legend, and that was what frightened them most. For the Virgin, every day was a test. She felt the eyes of the town on her wherever she walked, measuring her, weighing her, branding her with names she never asked to carry. Yet when she looked at her son, none of that mattered. His laughter was hers, his small hand in hers steadied her, and she knew that whatever judgment the world cast, the child was worth every shadow she had to stand under. But the return of the Apache had stirred feelings she had locked away, memories that came back in flashes, the sound of his voice that night, the way the stars had looked so close above them, the warmth that had burned through her like fire, and left her forever changed. She could not erase it, nor could she speak it, for words had no place in what had passed between them. The boy, though, had no such silence in him. He began to wander closer to the edge of the fields, where the Apache often lingered. At first it was small an extra glance, a few steps nearer than before. Then, one evening, when the village was busy with chores, he strayed far enough that he stood only a few paces from the man himself. The Apache crouched low, meeting his eyes, and though no words were spoken, the boy did not flinch. It was as if something unspoken had passed between them, something deeper than blood or language. The boy returned to his mother's side with a smile that unsettled her, for she knew that a bond had begun to form, one she could not control. The villagers grew restless. Meetings were held in barns lit by lantern light, men arguing in hushed voices about what must be done. Some demanded the Apache be driven out, others warned against stirring trouble. A few insisted the preacher should intervene, though even he seemed uncertain, torn between scripture and fear. The tension wound tighter each night, until it seemed the whole town was a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. One evening, as the sun bled into the hills and the sky turned the color of ash, the Virgin walked home with her son at her side. The road was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that carried warning. She sensed eyes on her from the shadows, though she could not see who watched. When they reached their door, she found a mark carved into the wood, a rough cross cut deep. She ran her hand over it, her heart pounding, for she knew it was no accident. Someone in the village wanted her to understand. She was no longer simply judged. She was being warned. She did not speak of it to anyone, not even to the Apache, though she knew he had seen it too. His gaze lingered on the mark the next day. His jaw set, his silence heavier than any words could be. The boy, too, noticed, asking questions his mother could not answer. She hushed him, but in his eyes was the same fire she had seen that night 3 years ago. The fire that had bound her fate to the man now standing once again at the edge of her world. The days passed, but the mark on her door remained, a reminder that the village's patience was wearing thin. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind, wondering if it carried footsteps, if the shadows beyond her window held more than trees. The Apache stayed close, though never too close, his presence a shield that both comforted and unsettled her. The villagers' whispers grew sharper, their stares colder and still. The boy wandered closer to the man who was both his father and a stranger. Then came the day when the boy disappeared into the fields and did not return by sundown. The virgin's heart pounded as she searched, calling his name into the empty air. The villagers gathered, some to help, others to watch, their eyes filled with something darker than concern. And when at last she reached the edge of the woods, she saw them, her son, standing beside the Apache, small hand clasped in his, both of them looking back at her with a silence that seemed to shake the earth itself. Before she could cry out, before she could run, the sound of boots pounded the road behind her. The men of the village had come, rifles in hand, faces hard with a decision already made. The virgin froze, torn between the two worlds before her, the child she loved, the man she had once given her heart to, and the cold, unyielding village that had raised her. The boy squeezed the Apache's hand, fearless, while the virgin's breath caught in her chest. The rifles rose. The sun dipped low. And in that moment, the story of their lives balanced on the edge of something that could not be undone. The rifles gleamed in the fading light, their barrels catching the last of the sun as the men tightened their grip. The virgin stood rooted to the dirt road, her breath quick and shallow, her eyes darting between her son and the Apache who held his hand. The boy looked unafraid, but there was no mistaking the storm gathering in the air. Every villager present could feel it. Something greater than their laws, greater than their judgment, was pressing down upon them all. The Apache did not move. His stance was steady, his eyes fixed on the line of men, but it was clear that he had been here before, standing on the edge of violence, measuring whether blood would fall to the earth. The preacher's voice rose first, sharp against the tension. He pleaded with the men to lower their guns, his words trembling but determined. Yet his plea carried no weight with those whose anger had grown too thick to be thinned by Scripture. They muttered among themselves, calling the Apache a danger, claiming he had bewitched the virgin, and that the boy himself was a seed of unrest, a reminder of the night no one dared speak of plainly. The blacksmith, broad-shouldered and red-faced, barked that no town could stand on foundations cracked by such a story. His hammer could forge steel, but it could not beat out the whispers that poisoned their days. The virgin stepped forward, her heart pounding louder than the words being thrown back and forth. She begged them not to harm him, not to frighten her son. Her voice was steady at first, then broke as she saw one man's finger twitch near the trigger. But the Apache lifted a hand, not toward the rifles, not in defiance, but in a gesture of calm that seemed to silence even the wind. For a breath, the men froze, caught in the weight of his gaze. Then, slowly, he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder as though to show that no harm would ever come from him. The boy smiled faintly, small and innocent, his trust unshaken. But the moment did not ease the tension. If anything, it thickened it. The men saw that silent bond and felt something stir: fear, envy, perhaps even shame. They were fathers themselves, bound to their families by duty and law. Yet here was a man they had named outsider, showing a kind of claim that none of them could deny. And it unsettled them, for it reminded them of the truths they had buried deep. The days that followed did not quiet the storm. The Apache did not leave, and the boy sought him more openly, drawn by a pull no scolding could undo. He asked questions of his mother, about where he came from, about the man whose eyes mirrored his own. She tried to answer, but every word felt like a thread pulled too tight, threatening to unravel the little fabric of safety she still held. She feared that one day the boy would walk into the woods with the Apache and never return. And yet she feared just as much the idea that the men of the village might make certain he never had the chance. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. Some said the Apache had returned to take revenge. Others claimed he would try to lead the boy away and raise him among his people. Still others whispered of curses, of punishment that would fall on the town if they allowed the child to grow. Under his shadow, the preacher tried to calm them with sermons of forgiveness and patience, but his voice was losing strength. Even in the pews he saw heads shaking, jaws tight, men whispering to their wives that faith was not enough to guard a village from ruin. The Virgin bore the worst of it. Women who once spoke kindly to her now turned away. Children who once played with her son were pulled indoors when he passed. Even those who pitied her did not stand by her side, for pity was safer than loyalty. Each trip to the marketplace felt like walking through a gauntlet of stairs, each one sharp enough to wound. Yet through it all, she kept her chin high, her hand steady on her child's shoulder, though inside fear gnawed at her with every step. In the midst of this unrest, smaller stories began to weave into the larger one. The blacksmith's daughter, quiet and watchful, had taken to slipping small kindnesses to the Virgin, an extra piece of cloth, a loaf of bread left at her door. She said little, but her eyes held sympathy, as if she too knew what it meant to live under a weight not chosen. Then there was the old midwife, who muttered that the child was marked by fate and that no gun, no sermon, no whispered threat could undo what had already been written. She urged caution, reminding anyone who would listen that stories like these had a way of ending in fire if not handled with care. And still, the Apache remained. He slept near the tree line, far enough not to intrude, close enough to remind them he was not gone. At night, villagers swore they saw his shadow move against the moonlight, a figure that seemed larger than a man, more like a piece of the earth itself. Some children whispered that he could speak to the wolves, that they howled louder when he walked. Others said they had seen him kneel with his hand pressed to the soil, as if speaking to the land in a language older than their own. The boy grew more restless. He asked questions his mother could not answer without tearing open wounds she barely held closed. He wanted to know why the men in town hated his father, why his eyes did not look like theirs, why the stories whispered about him carried more fear than truth. The Virgin tried to shield him, but children are sharper than they seem. He knew there was something in him that set him apart, and he wanted to understand it, even if it led him into the woods where danger waited. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, a knock came at the Virgin's door. It was the preacher, his face worn with worry. He warned her that the men were growing restless again, that they had spoken of driving the Apache out by force. He did not say what they meant by force, but his eyes carried the answer. He urged her to keep the boy close, to avoid the fields, though he knew such advice could not undo what fate had already tied. Before he left, he placed his hand on her shoulder and whispered that some stories cannot be prayed away, they must be endured. The next day, the boy vanished again, slipping away from his mother's watchful eye. She found him in the clearing. By the woods, sitting cross-legged across from the Apache, a small bird cupped in his hands. The man was showing him how to hold it gently, how to feel its heart beating without causing it harm. The boy's face glowed with wonder, and for a moment she saw peace there, a peace she had not seen in months. But when she looked up, she saw the blacksmith watching from a distance, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. She knew the story of that moment would spread by nightfall, twisted into something dangerous. And so it did. The villagers gathered again, louder this time, angrier, their voices sharp as knives. Some spoke of banishment, others of harsher measures. The preacher pleaded, but few listened. The Virgin held her son close, feeling the walls of her world closing in. The Apache stood at the edge, silent but unyielding, his presence alone enough to stir their fury. The boy clung to both worlds, the warmth of his mother's embrace and the steady strength of the man whose blood ran in his veins. He did not understand the danger that pressed on them from all sides, nor the way the town seemed ready to break itself apart over his existence. All he knew was that the man in the woods was not the monster they named him to be. As the sun dipped behind the hills once more, the Virgin knew the storm was nearing its peak. The rifles had not yet fired, but the weight of them pressed heavier with each passing day. The boy's questions grew sharper, the whispers grew louder, and the Apache's silence carried the promise of a reckoning that had not yet come. And in that silence, the village waited, trembling, caught between the world it knew and the story it feared was already written. The wind that evening was sharper than usual, carrying dust through the narrow roads of the village and rattling shutters like bones. People said it was a sign that storms always stirred before trouble. In every corner of town, the whispers had grown into plans. The blacksmith and the men who followed him no longer spoke in secret. They gathered openly now, oiling rifles, sharpening knives, saying the Apache's presence had become a threat too large to ignore. They claimed the Virgin had bewitched them all with silence and sorrow, that her child's blood carried a danger that would one day rise against them. Fear had turned into anger, and anger was turning into action. The preacher tried to stand between them and their violence, but his voice, though steady, no longer carried the weight it once had. Too many men felt the pull of their own pride. Too many women, though uneasy, kept their heads lowered, afraid of being marked next if they spoke out. Even those who pitied the Virgin turned their eyes away when her path crossed theirs. The town had reached a breaking point, and all it needed was a spark. The Virgin knew it. She felt it in the stares that lingered too long, in the quiet that fell when she entered a room, in the way her door seemed to creak louder at night as if warning her of footsteps creeping closer. Her son sensed it too. He asked fewer questions now, for he had begun to understand answers without words. He clung to her, yet his eyes still sought the Apache, searching for something she could not give him. The boy's pull toward his father grew stronger each day. He slipped into the fields whenever he could, racing through tall grass with bare feet, his laughter carrying on the wind. There, he found the Apache waiting. The man never called to him, never demanded his presence, but he was always there, steady as the trees. They sat together in silence, the boy tracing patterns in the dirt while the man carved small figures from wood. The bond between them deepened without words, as if they shared a language older than speech. It was this bond that drove the villagers deeper into fury. A child who bore the face of the Apache was one thing, but a child who willingly sought him out was something else. They said it was corruption, that the boy was being turned against his own blood, against the very people who raised him. Rumors spread that the Apache had taught him to fight, to hunt, to carry secrets no Christian boy should know. Each tale grew wilder, twisted by fear until truth and fiction blurred. By the time the blacksmith gathered the men again, there was no need for persuasion. Their minds were already set. The Virgin's nights were filled with sleepless hours. She lay awake, listening to the rustle of branches against the roof, every sound feeding her dread. She feared the moment the men would come, feared the knock that would not wait for her to answer. More than anything, she feared what her son might see, what it would do to him to watch the hatred of the town rise against the man he had come to trust. Yet even in her fear, she could not bring herself to drive the Apache away. Some part of her, buried deep but unshakable, knew his presence was not just danger, but also truth. And truth, once born, could not be killed. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she saw the boy sitting with the Apache by the tree line. He was laughing, holding up a wooden carving of a bird, its wings outstretched as if ready to fly. For a moment, her heart swelled at the sight. But then she caught movement further back, shadows shifting where no one should be. She knew the men were watching, feeding their fury with every shared glance between father and son. She pulled the boy home quickly that night, but she knew it was too late. The story of that bird would be told before the lamps were lit in every house. The preacher came again, his face lined with worry. He warned her that the men were planning something, though he did not know when. His voice shook as he said he feared even God's house might not hold them back this time. He urged her to take her son and hide, to flee into the hills before it was too late. But the Virgin knew escape was no longer possible. Running would only feed their anger, would only confirm the stories they told themselves. The storm was coming, and she could only pray to withstand it. The Apache seemed to know as well. That night, she saw him standing alone at the edge of the village, staring toward the chapel where the bell tower rose into the darkening sky. He did not move for a long time, as if listening to something deep within the earth. When at last he turned, his eyes met hers across the distance. No words passed between them, but the weight of his gaze settled in her chest. She knew he would not run. Whatever storm was coming, he would face it. The boy grew restless in the days that followed. He sensed the unease pressing down on the town, sensed the way his mother's hands trembled when she pulled him close, sensed the way the men's eyes burned when they passed him in the street. He asked his mother if he had done something wrong, if it was his fault that people looked at them with such coldness. She tried to reassure him, but her voice broke before the words could carry. He turned away then, staring out toward the fields, where he knew the Apache waited. The night before it all came to a head, the Virgin woke to find her son's bed empty. Panic tore through her as she searched, her voice breaking against the walls as she called his name. She ran to the fields, her heart pounding, and there she found him, sitting once more with the Apache. The boy's small hand rested on the man's knee, and in his other hand he held another carving, this one a wolf, fierce and strong. He looked up at her, smiling, as if the world were whole and safe. But behind them, she saw torchlight flickering in the distance. The men were gathering, their shadows long against the night sky. She pulled her son close, her breath ragged, her eyes wild. The Apache rose slowly, his face calm but his body tense, as though braced for what was coming. The torches drew nearer, voices rising, harsh and angry. The Virgin could hear the blacksmith's voice above them all, booming with the certainty of a man who believed he carried justice in his hands. The boy clutched the carving tight, his small fingers digging into the wood, unaware that the firelight approaching was not the warmth of safety but the blaze of judgment. The Virgin's chest tightened as the men came into view, rifles glinting, faces set hard. She could see neighbors she had known all her life, men who had shared bread at her table, women who had once smiled at her child. Now their eyes were sharp with something colder than hate, something closer to fear dressed as righteousness. The preacher followed behind them, his face pale, his lips moving in prayer, but his voice was lost in the roar of the others. The Apache stood tall, the boy at his side, the Virgin caught between them and the crowd. The torches flickered brighter, their flames painting the night in red and gold. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and dust, and every heartbeat felt like a drum pounding toward an end none of them could stop. The men spread out in a line, their rifles raised, their voices calling for the Apache to leave, to surrender, to face what they claimed was justice. But in their tone was no room for mercy. The Virgin clutched her son, her body trembling, her mind racing. She knew this was the moment everything had been building toward, the moment when silence would shatter and truth would no longer be hidden. The boy's eyes darted between his mother and his father, his small frame caught in the weight of two worlds. The Apache's gaze swept over the crowd, steady, unflinching, as if he had known all along it would come to this. And then, as the first rifle cocked, the boy stepped forward. The torches flared brighter in the wind. The men tightened their grips. The Virgin's scream caught in her throat. The preacher's prayer rose into the night. The moment hung there, heavy, waiting to break. The boy stood between the rifles and the Apache, his small frame outlined by the flames of the torches. For a breathless moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The virgin's heart pounded in her chest, her hands outstretched but frozen, unable to move him back. The preacher's prayers faltered into silence, and the blacksmith's voice, so loud before, broke into a stammer as he realized the child had stepped into the line of fire. Every man who held a weapon felt the weight of what was before them, not just an enemy they believed they hated, but the life of a child born of two worlds, staring at them with wide, steady eyes. The Apache did not reach for the boy, nor did he flinch at the raised guns. He stood rooted in the dirt, his gaze locked on the crowd, as if daring them to choose what kind of men they truly were. The boy's voice, small but clear, cut through the night. He said they should not hurt his father. The word, father, rang out sharper than any bullet could, and it struck the crowd in a place deeper than fear. Some lowered their rifles without realizing, their hands trembling at the sound of innocence naming truth aloud. The virgin rushed forward then, pulling her son close, her arms wrapping him tight as though she could shield him from the world. She looked at the men with a fierceness none of them had ever seen in her before. Her voice, broken yet strong, rose above the firelight. She told them that she had carried her burden in silence, that she had let their whispers wound her, but that no more words would be hidden. The boy was her child, her blood, her gift, and the Apache was part of him. If they sought to erase him, they would have to erase her as well. The blacksmith tried to rally the others, but his voice faltered under the weight of her words. Preacher stepped forward, his hands raised, his voice stronger now than it had been in months. He reminded the men that they were fathers too, that their children would one day look at them and ask what kind of men they had been. He asked them what story they wanted their children to remember, that they had raised rifles against a boy, and his mother, or that they had chosen mercy when hate demanded blood. One by one, the rifles lowered. The torches still burned, but the fire in the men's eyes dimmed. Some muttered under their breath, some spat into the dirt, but none dared pull a trigger. The blacksmith's face was red with fury, yet even he could not bear the sight of the boy clutching his mother's dress, staring up at the crowd with frightened but unyielding eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft rustle of the night wind. The virgin turned to the Apache then. Their eyes met across the space, and in that look was the story of everything they had carried fear. Memory, love, and the weight of a bond that had never been spoken but had never died. The boy, still pressed to her side, reached out a hand toward him, and the Apache stepped forward, slow and steady, until he stood close enough for the boy to place the wooden wolf carving into his palm. No words were needed. The gesture was enough. The crowd lingered, uneasy, caught between relief and resentment. Some left quietly, torches lowered, unwilling to face the truth of what had nearly been done. Others whispered of curses and shame, but their voices lacked the fire they once carried. The preacher remained, his face drawn but peaceful, as though he had seen a lesson deeper than his own sermons could teach. The blacksmith stormed away, his pride wounded, though everyone knew his voice would not ring as loud in the days to come. In the weeks that followed, the village began to shift. The virgin was no longer looked upon with pity or scorn, but with a wary respect. People still whispered, for old habits die hard, but the sharpness in their words dulled. The boy grew bolder, running through the fields without being pulled away, laughing as children slowly returned to his side. Some mothers, still uneasy, pulled their little ones back, but others allowed them to play, realizing the child was not a threat but a spark of life. They had nearly extinguished with their own fear. The Apache remained at the edge of the village. He did not move into its heart, nor did he vanish back into the hills. He stayed where he could watch, where the boy could find him, where the Virgin could meet his eyes without needing to speak. Some nights, villagers saw the boy walking too. Him, carrying another carving in his small hands, a bird, a deer, a fish carved with careful effort. Other nights, they saw the Apache kneeling in the fields, the boy's laughter ringing as he learned the rhythms of the earth. The preacher's sermon softened, carrying less warning and more grace. He spoke of how fear can build walls higher than any fence and how mercy can tear them down. He did not name names, but everyone knew what he meant. Even those who still harbored anger could not deny the change in the air. The way the village breathed easier after the night no bullets were fired. The Virgin carried herself differently, too. She no longer lowered her eyes when she passed through the market. She held her head high, her son's hand in hers, her silence no longer a burden but a choice. She had faced the fire of the crowd and had not been burned. She had claimed her truth, and in doing so, had found a strength she had never known she carried. The boy grew into that strength as well. He no longer asked if he had done wrong, no longer questioned why people looked at him with unease. He knew who he was now, child of his mother, child of his father, child of a story that had nearly broken but instead had endured. His laughter filled the spaces between the houses, a reminder that innocence had won over hate, at least for a time. Still, the past could not be erased. There were men who grumbled in the shadows, women who warned their children not to wander too far. The blacksmith's bitterness lingered like a storm cloud, ready to break if given the chance. Yet even he could not undo what had been seen that night, the boy stepping into the firelight, calling a man father, and stopping a storm of bullets with nothing more than truth. The Virgin often thought back to the night 3 years before, the night when stars seemed close enough to touch. She had once carried it as a burden, a secret locked tight within her. Now she carried it as part of herself, not with shame but with a quiet pride. She had chosen love in a world that had offered only fences, and though the years had been cruel, she knew she would choose the same again. As autumn settled over the valley, the air crisp and sharp with the scent of wood smoke, the Virgin stood on her porch one evening, watching her son run through the fields toward the tree line. The Apache waited there, tall and steady, the wooden wolf tucked at his side. The boy's laughter carried across the distance, and in that sound she heard both past and future. The village behind her hummed with the small, ordinary sounds of life, wagons rattling, dogs barking, doors closing against the chill. It was the same village it had always been, yet somehow it was different too. Something had shifted, something that could not be undone. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would still be whispers, still be anger, still be storms waiting to rise. But she also knew that some stories, once lived, cannot be silenced. Her son was living proof of that. The Apache's steady presence was proof of that. And her own heart, no longer bowed beneath shame, was proof as well. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Virgin whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not for protection, but for strength. Strength to carry her truth, strength to guard her child, strength to face whatever lay beyond the horizon. She knew now that the story of their lives would not be erased. It would be told, in whispers and in silence, in firelight and in laughter, for as long as the valley stood. And as the first stars appeared above, close enough to touch, she knew that was enough.